In this video we will review some facts about South Carolina. But before we start, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for future updates. South Carolina's past as a former Confederate state has earned it a terrible reputation. But South Carolina is more than just a state of former slaves who struggled to keep slavery. Discover more about South Carolina with these 50 facts. The terrain of South Carolina is distinct. For starters, South Carolina is bounded by only two states, North Carolina to the north and Georgia to the southwest. The state confronts the Atlantic Ocean to the southeast, with the Atlantic coastal plain dominating the eastern topography. The Piedmont Plateau dominates the state's core region and has some of the world's oldest rocks. Scientists discovered they date back to the Paleozoic era, between 541 and 252 million years ago. Finally, the Blue Ridge dominates the state's western geography, with sections of it dating back to the Piedmont. Some of the rocks in the mountains date back to the Precambrian era, and are over 541 million years old. Sassafras Mountain, South Carolina's highest peak, is also part of the Blue Ridge. In 1886, an earthquake ravaged the state. The 1886 Charleston earthquake, which occurred on the morning of August 31 that year. It had a magnitude of 6.9 to 7.3 and destroyed or damaged around 2,000 structures in Charleston, South Carolina. It also killed 60 people, and the damage was estimated to cost $6 million at the time, or $158 million now. The earthquake also had an impact on the remainder of the state and its neighbors. States as far afield as Massachusetts and Louisiana were affected, as were faraway islands like Cuba and Bermuda. Some experts feared that the quake might lead Florida to separate from the rest of the continent. South Carolina has a consistent climate. In particular, a humid subtropical climate with hot and humid summers and moderate winters. Summer temperatures often range between 30 and 34 degrees Celsius, while winter temperatures range between 0 and 16 degrees Celsius. Snow is still unusual in South Carolina, with about 6 inches falling in a year. The upper elevations of the Blue Ridge Mountains, on the other hand, see up to 12 inches of snow every year. In contrast, the state receives a lot of rain, with an average of 2 meters per year. Thunderstorms are most prevalent in the summer and autumn, although hurricanes can occur at any time of year except the summer. Tornadoes can also affect South Carolina, most often in the spring. In 1954, Hurricane Hazel destroyed the state. Hurricane Hazel, which hit in October of that year, had wind gusts of up to 215 km per hour, making it a Category 4 storm. It caused storm surges up to 3 meters high throughout the coastline and damaged an estimated 80% of all coastal houses. Indeed, the storm swamped the barrier islands off the coast, which were meant to protect them from floods. Scientists credit this to the storm as well as the time, with the storm making ashore during high tide. In the end, while just one person died as a result of the storm, hundreds more were injured. Damages were projected to be $163 million, with $61 million occurring near the shore. In 1989, Hurricane Hugo destroyed the state. Hurricane Hugo, which hit in September of that year, had wind gusts of up to 260 km per hour, making it a Category 5 storm. Storm surges were from 2.4 meters in Charleston to 6.1 meters elsewhere along the South Carolina coastline. In the end, the storm killed 35 people and inflicted $6 billion in damage across the state. The Red Cross alone documented the loss of an estimated 3,000 dwellings and the damage to an additional 18,000 homes. The hurricane also damaged 1/3 of the state's timber supplies, or enough wood to build 700,000 dwellings. According to commercial estimates, the storm destroyed 21% of the state's softwood inventories and 6% of the state's hardwood stocks. Climate change is a significant hazard to South Carolina. According to scientists, global warming has boosted temperatures in the state by 1.5 degrees in the last 100 years. This has resulted in increasing sea levels of around 4 centimeters every decade, which scientists predict will continue in the future. They expect that sea levels will increase by at least 1 meter off the coast of South Carolina by 2100. While they concede that this projection is lower than that of New York City, it would nonetheless devastate the South Carolina marshes. This, in turn, may decimate seabird and shellfish populations, perhaps leading to extinctions. Rising temperatures would also lead to more severe storms and droughts. However, the South Carolina state government has yet to present a comprehensive strategy to address the issue of climate change as of 2020. In the 16th century, both Spain and France attempted and failed to settle the territory. The Spaniards made the first attempt in 1526, with the establishment of San Miguel de Gualdape, not far from contemporary Georgetown. It was also the first European settlement in what would later become the United States. However, San Miguel de Gualdape barely lasted 8 months before being abandoned due to a mixture of sickness, Native American raids, and other circumstances. Only 150 of the initial 500 immigrants survived to return to Spain. Later, in 1562, French Protestants fleeing persecution in Europe founded Charles Fort Santa Elena on Paris Island. The town collapsed again in less than a year, and they attempted again in 1564, but it too failed. As a result, both Spain and France abandoned ambitions to colonize Carolina in favor of focusing on Florida. Early on, slavery became significant business in South Carolina. South Carolina became the most important entrance site for African slaves to North America beginning in 1670. Initially, only European traffickers brought slaves for sale, but American colonists soon joined them in their slave expeditions on Africa. South Carolina transferred an estimated 50,000 slaves to neighboring colonies between 1670 and 1715 alone. The export money, together with a large number of slaves to labor on the local plantations, all contributed to South Carolina being the hub of the British Empire in the American South. Because of the colony's richness and vast population, the British finally made South Carolina a crown colony in 1719. South Carolina rose to prominence as a leader in the Revolutionary movement. The region took part in the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, when colonists challenged the demand that publishers use specially stamped British paper. In reaction to increasing taxes imposed by Britain during the 7 Years' War, South Carolina adopted the phrase, "No taxation without representation." In 1773, Charleston imitated the legendary Boston Tea Party by throwing imported tea into the sea to protest British taxation. Other British products were also boycotted, with colonists refusing to buy them and allowing them to decay in warehouses, resulting in significant losses for British exporters. Finally, South Carolina sent delegates to the Continental Congress in 1774. As a result, the state signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. During the American Revolution, South Carolina saw several engagements. In fact, South Carolina hosted 1/3 of all engagements throughout the American Revolution, more than any other state. The Siege of Charleston in 1780 was one of them, when Britain attempted to break the deadlock by striking from the south. The British invaded the city for the first time on March 29 that year, and conquered it on May 12. This was the Patriots' worst loss during the American Revolution. Later that month, they defeated the Patriots at the Battle of Waxhaw. However, Britain's brutal retaliation against guerrillas, as well as its pursuit of suspected patriots and scorched earth tactics, reversed their advances. Instead of assaulting George Washington from the south, they were now trapped in a violent stalemate in the southern countryside. In the run-up to the Civil War, South Carolina had a strained relationship with the federal government. The state's society was controlled by wealthy landowners who despised the federal government's attempts to assert its authority. South Carolina became a bastion for supporters of limited government and states' rights, as well as opponents of the U.S. Constitution, as early as the 1820s. The state administration aggressively worked to block the collection of federal taxes after South Carolina courts declared them illegal in 1832. As a result of this, the United States Congress authorized the use of military action to bring South Carolina into line with the federal government. By the 1850s, slavery had become the most contentious issue in the United States. For one instance, in South Carolina, only slave owners with at least 10 slaves were eligible to vote. They considered the victory of openly anti-slavery Abraham Lincoln as the greatest threat to their civilization in 1860. This resulted in South Carolina seceding from the United States before the end of the year. South Carolina made significant contributions to the Confederate cause. For one thing, with the seizure of Fort Sumter on April 13, 1861, South Carolina delivered the opening blow of the American Civil War. Ironically, South Carolina would also see the war's final engagement, when the Union retook Fort Sumter in 1865. The hoisting of the Stars and Stripes above the fort became a symbol of American victory. South Carolina provided an estimated 60,000 troops to the Confederate cause in total. An estimated 13,000 men perished in conflict, accounting for 23% of the country's adult white male population. South Carolina was the state that lost the greatest proportion of its population during the Civil War. South Carolina is known for being the only state that heavily backed the Confederacy. In reality, many men in every other Confederate state remained faithful to the Union, often abandoning their homes to join the Union Army. Only African Americans from South Carolina ever served in the Union Army, either as slaves or when the Union Army arrived to liberate them. During the Civil War, General Sherman became known for his exploits in the state. When battling the Confederacy in Georgia, the general had previously adopted a scorched earth approach. This included the intentional demolition of industries, workshops, and even infrastructure like as roads and bridges. Union forces also destroyed plantations and farms while freeing slaves. This assured the demise of the Confederacy's already limited industries, as well as their economy. The effect was exacerbated by the abolition of slavery, because, unlike the Union, the Confederacy relied entirely on slave labor. General Sherman's victory in Georgia encouraged him to continue the tactic as he marched into South Carolina. Unlike in Georgia, where many of his officers and soldiers were skeptical of utilizing scorched earth, such reservations evaporated in South Carolina. Union soldiers blamed South Carolina for the war and all of its loss and suffering. As a result, whole towns and cities, such as Columbia and its neighboring suburbs, were destroyed. South Carolina suffered throughout the post-Civil War Reconstruction period. The abolition of slavery, along with the destruction of the war and the loss of a large portion of the adult white male population, led the state's economy to nearly collapse. In addition, the federal government supported a pro-union leadership comprised of freed slaves, white Northerners, and sympathetic Southerners. South Carolina was likewise denied representation in the U.S. Congress until 1869. This resulted in animosity of the federal government and the expansion of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, to impose Southern white supremacy. Ulysses Grant replied by deploying federal soldiers to bring down the KKK, but most of the members escaped by moving to neighboring states. In 1877, the federal government ultimately withdrew its soldiers, allowing the then white supremacist Democratic Party to retake control of the state government. After Reconstruction ended, racial discrimination became a governmental policy. When the Democrats regained power of South Carolina in 1878, they enacted what became known as Jim Crow laws. They were able to deprive most African Americans of their voting rights through a combination of poll fees, residence restrictions, and even literacy tests. In fact, despite accounting for 58% of South Carolina's population in 1900, African Americans had no representation in state government. They also implemented segregation, which limited the occupations available to African Americans, where they could reside, and which public services they could use. While whites were equally disadvantaged by segregation, whites usually had higher-paying occupations and better public services. South Carolina, strangely, rejected a one-drop law. Governor Ben Tillman proposed the law in 1895, which would have deprived anyone of mixed descent of white identity. Surprisingly, South Carolina's state legislators voted against the bill because too many of them were of mixed heritage. Not only do they have African American ancestors, but also Hispanic and Asian forebears, although just once or twice in their family trees. They also managed to garner popular support for their opposition to the one-drop legislation, citing the fact that many Confederate troops and even ordinary citizens had mixed heritage. Ironically, they were also able to reconcile this with their racial goals. They specifically said that a few drops of mixed blood gave whites a strong feeling of purpose that they would not have had otherwise. South Carolina later grappled with the civil rights movement. Of course, considering how firmly racism had been ingrained in the state by the 1960s, this is hardly unexpected. Surprisingly, the civil rights movement saw less violence in the state than in other states. This stemmed from activists and opponents' common idea that any reform or opposition to it should be as non-violent as possible. This did, however, give South Carolina's leaders a reputation for playing by the rules, which they exploited by appearing reasonable. Despite this, progress was sluggish but steady, with desegregation beginning as early as 1963. Full desegregation became a reality, at least formally, in the 1970s. Segregation persisted unofficially as white parents refused to send their children to public schools. They instead sent them to private schools, which most African Americans could not afford. South Carolina's population is unusually diversified. Whites gained the majority in the 1930s, although they now account for just 66% of the state's population. This was caused by a large exodus of African Americans from the state in quest of better opportunities to the north. Nonetheless, African Americans are the state's second biggest ethnicity and the largest non-white ethnicity, accounting for 26% of the population. Hispanics come in third position behind African Americans, accounting for an estimated 7% of South Carolina's population. Asian Americans and Native Americans account for around 2% of the state's population. Finally, members of other ethnic groups account for an estimated 1% of the state's population. The same is true for the faiths of the state. The different Protestant denominations account for the bulk of the state's faiths, with an estimated 66% following. The denominations calling themselves evangelical Protestantism account for 35% of them. Another 16% is made up of mainstream Protestant faiths such as Lutheranism and Calvinism, among others. At 15%, African American dominated Protestant congregations in South Carolina are classified as Black Protestants. Following Protestants, Catholics account for an estimated 10% of South Carolina's population. Other Christian faiths, such as Eastern Orthodox, account for only 2% of the population. Other religions, such as Islam or Buddhism, account for another 2% of the population. Surprisingly, South Carolina has the highest concentration of followers of one of them, the Baha'i faith. Finally, 20% of the population does not identify as religious or does not know what religion they belong to. Columbia, the state capital, dates back to the 16th century. In 1540, the Spanish adventurer Fernando de Soto went to the area. He noted the presence of supposedly Native Americans along the path at the time. However, it would not be until the 1700s when Europeans began to settle in the region, beginning with Fort Congress. The fort not only protected the Congaree River and any adjacent villages from Native American invaders, but it also served as a trade center. The colonial authority eventually built a ferry service for the region's dispersed population. The colonists also took use of the region's waterfalls, turning mills for a range of chores ranging from manufacturing to farming. Following the American Revolution, local inhabitants chose Columbia as the state capital. This occurred in 1786, and Columbia won because of its central location in South Carolina. A state senator advocated renaming the city Washington after George Washington, but the motion was defeated in the state assembly. Nonetheless, the state legislature did not relocate to Columbia until 1790. Columbia did not even obtain village status until 1805 and would not become a city until 1854. However, its status as the state's political capital resulted in rapid infrastructure development. For example, between 1786 and 1800, Columbia constructed the Santee Canal, one of the earliest canals in the United States. Columbia was ravaged by the Civil War. Columbia holds the distinction of being the site where the Civil War actually began, the state legislature voting 159-0 to separate the Union in December 1860. For the most part, the Civil War spared the city, with it changed in February 1865. Union forces led by General Sherman marched across Georgia that month. The commander ordered the destruction of all industry in the city as part of the Scorched Earth campaign against the Confederacy. This, in turn, sparked a fire that burned much of the city, something General Sherman subsequently regretted. He also accused the Confederacy of the fire, alleging that they had purposefully heated and set fire to crops in the street. They intended for the fires to slow down the Union Army. However, high winds caused the fires to spread out of control. In Columbia, the civil rights movement achieved a number of wins. One of these successes occurred even before the movement got traction in the 1960s. A federal judge in Columbia declared in 1945 that African American teachers in the state should be paid the same as white instructors. Despite objections from white nationalists, the court had established a legal precedent. The issue of segregated schools in Columbia was utilized by the United States Supreme Court in 1954 to determine that segregation was unconstitutional nationally. The city's previously white-only chain businesses began serving African Americans in 1962. After a year, segregation in the city's public schools began to fade. Heavy industry is prevalent in South Carolina today. For example, the upstate region is home to a Michelin tire facility that dates back to the 1970s. Because of the great number of German automobile manufacturing there, the area near Interstate 85 in the upstate has earned the moniker, Autobahn. BMW's first vehicle manufacturing outside of Germany, which opened in 1995 between Greenville and Spartanburg, is one of them. The facility has continuously developed over the decades and is now BMW's largest manufacturing in the world. Today, the plant alone is anticipated to contribute $17 billion to the state's GDP. Aside from autos, South Carolina also has a foothold in the aircraft sector. Boeing, in instance, established a plant in North Charleston that had a comparable influence on the state economy as BMW's plant. Tourism is also quite popular in the state nowadays. Since the 1960s, the low country of South Carolina has been a tourist destination. The causes that contributed to this date back to the 1920s, when the growth of the local road network made it easier to move throughout the countryside. State investments in the tourism sector began in the 1940s, but the establishment of the South Carolina Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism in 1967 accelerated the growth of the business. Domestic visitors alone contribute an estimated $14 billion to the state economy each year, according to government estimates. In addition to the low country, an estimated 7 million visitors visit Charleston each year. This enables the city to earn $8 billion of the entire revenue generated by South Carolina's tourism sector each year. Economic discrimination is also prevalent in South Carolina. This was notably evident during the Great Recession of 2008, when economic researchers noted that African American neighborhoods suffered more than white areas. They also recognized that whites had consistently controlled the real estate business, with African Americans losing land for economic reasons as far back as the 20th century. African Americans attempting to purchase land had a 31% failure rate. Whites, on the other hand, only have a 10% failure rate. Indeed, the economic gap between whites and African Americans in South Carolina has been constant for the past 70 years. This is especially evident in the fact that African Americans in the state earn barely 60% of what whites earn. The state has a well-developed public transportation system. South Carolina has the fourth largest road system in the United States, comprising an estimated 47,000 kilometers. In terms of railways, Amtrak runs 4 passenger lines in the state. The Crescent route serves the upstate, while the Silver Star route serves the Midlands. The Palmetto and Silver Meteor routes, which both service the low country, are also available. Other railway firms, the largest of which are CSX Transportation and Norfolk Southern, also provide freight services. South Carolina also has 7 airports, the most notable of which being Charleston International Airport. It serves an estimated 5 million people per year and is located 19 kilometers northwest of Charleston. It does, however, have a checkered record when it comes to education. For one reason, South Carolina does not adhere to international math and language standards. In reality, in 2014, the South Carolina Supreme Court decided that the state had failed to satisfy constitutional obligations for public education. In 2015, the state received a national SAT average score of 1490, which was 48 points lower than the national average. While South Carolina is the only state with a public school bus system, financing concerns have resulted in an outdated and deteriorating bus fleet. According to records, half of the state's school buses date back more than 15 years. Some buses date back more than 30 years. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, even donated $1 million to South Carolina in 2017 to replace aging buses with newer, more ecologically friendly buses. The same may be said about the state's healthcare system. When it comes to the quality of a state healthcare system, South Carolina ranks 33rd out of all U.S. states. The state, in particular, has a high prevalence of teen pregnancy, with 53 young moms for every 1,000 teenage females. In comparison, the national average is 41 adolescent moms for every 1,000 teenage females. Likewise, the state has a high infant mortality rate of 10 fatalities per 1,000 births. This, once again, contrasts with the national average of 7 fatalities for every 1,000 births. Nonetheless, the state is within the U.S. average of 3 doctors per 1,000 residents. The state's people also spend the U.S. average of $5,000 per family on health care. South Carolina, on the other hand, has 34% more obese youngsters than the national average of 32%. South Carolina's athletic record is likewise mixed. For starters, South Carolina does not have a club that primarily represents it in any major league sport. They do, however, share teams with neighboring North Carolina, including the Carolina Panthers in football and the Carolina Hurricanes in ice hockey. South Carolina also competes in collegiate athletics, which are immensely popular. These include the South Carolina Gamecocks and the Clemson Tigers, both NCAA teams. Other teams in the NCAA include the Citadel Bulldogs, the Furman Paladins, and the Wofford Terriers. South Carolina also holds NASCAR races on a regular basis, including the Southern 500, the Welland Series, and the Xfinity Series. The state even features a NASCAR racetrack, the Darlington Raceway. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel, since we will be covering a lot of similar content in the future. Till next time, stay curious.